Let's now go to the topic prenatal development. Prenatal development is also called the antenatal development in humans, and this is the process encompassing the period from the formation of an embryo through the development of a fetus to up to birth, or what we call the parturition. The human body, like that most of animals, develops from a single cell produced by the union of a male and a female gamete, or the sex cell. This union marks the beginning of the prenatal period, which in humans encompasses three distinct stages. First is the pre-embryonic stage, the first 2 weeks of development, which is a period of cell division and initial differentiation, or the cell maturation. Second is the embryonic period or period of organogenesis, which lasts from the third to the eighth week of development. And next is the fetal period, which is characterized by the maturation of tissues and organs and rapid growth of the body. The prenatal period ends with parturition and is followed by a long postnatal period. Only at about age 25 years are the last progressive changes completed. So today we're going to talk about only the pre-embryonic stage and the embryonic period, so as to not give you the information overload. Here, the pre-embryonic and embryonic development, much of the embryonic developmental machinery or the cellular apparatus used in formation of human beings, no, or the human development, it is similar to that used by other vertebrates as well as, for example, here, shark, lizard, no, etc., etc., and also some invertebrates. The machinery is essential for four processes: the cell proliferation, cell specialization, cell interaction, and cell movement. And during these processes, the approximately 20 to 25,000 genes in the human genome give rise to as many as 100,000 different proteins, which give the conceptus form and substance. Let's go to fertilization. The development and liberation of the male and female gametes are steps preparatory to their union through the process of fertilization. Active movements first bring some spermatozoa into contact with follicle cells, adhering to the secondary oocyte or the immature egg cell, which still lies high in the uterine tube or the fallopian tube. The sperm then propel themselves past the follicle cells, right, and attach to the surface of the zona pellucida, as we can all remember, and then enclosing the oocyte. Some sperm heads, they successfully penetrate the capsule by means of an enzyme that they secrete, which is called the hyaluronidase, but only one sperm lang ang makamake contact with the cell membrane and cytoplasm of the oocyte. This is because the invading sperms, their head releases a substance that initiates surface changes in the oocyte that render its membrane impermeable to other spermatozoa, hindi na makaagi. The successful sperm is engulfed by a conical protrusion of the oocyte cytoplasm, and then it is drawn inward. Once within the periphery of the oocyte, the sperm advances toward the center of the cytoplasm, and then what happens is that the head swells and converts into a typical nucleus, which we now call the male pronucleus, and then its tail detaches. It is during the progress of these events that the oocyte initiates its final maturation, division, and following the separation of the second polar body or ang one or two polar bodies to bala, that are produced during division, the oocyte nucleus typically it reconstitutes and then ginatawag na siya nga female pronucleus of the ripe egg. It is now ready to unite with its male counterpart, the male pronucleus, and thereby consummate the total events of fertilization. The two pronuclei, the male and female pronuclei, next approach, they meet midway in the egg cytoplasm and they lose their nuclear membranes and each resolves its diffuse chromatin material into a complete single set of 23 chromosomes. Each chromosome is composed of two chromatids na ginaheld together at the center by what we call the centromere. And during mitosis, the centromeres attach to a bundle of microtubules known as the mitotic spindle, which is formed by centrioles. And this climax in the events of fertilization creates a joint nga nagaproduce sang zygote. Ano ang zygote? It contains all the factors essential for the development of a new individual. The fundamental results of fertilization are the following: reassociation of the male and female set of chromosomes, thus restoring the full number and providing the basis of biparental inheritance and for variation. Next is establishment of the mechanism of sex determination for the individual. This depending on whether the male set of chromosomes include the X or the Y chromosome. It determines whether the offspring will be male or female. And lastly, it's the activation of the zygote initiating further development na sang body parts. Here, we can see the cleavage and blastulation. Through the process of mitosis, the relatively enormous zygote directly subdivides into many smaller cells of conventional size, suitable as early building of units or building units for future organism. So as you can see, zone pellucida, it then divides and then further divides. This process is called cleavage, and the resulting cells are blastomeres. The tendency for the progressive increase in cell numbers to follow a doubling sequence is soon disturbed and then lost. Each blastomere receives the full complement of paternal and maternal chromosomes. Subdivision of the zygote into blastomeres begins while it is still high in the fallopian tube or the uterine tube. The cohering blastomeres are transported downward, chiefly at least by muscular contractions of the tubal wall. Such transport is relatively dasig, rapid until the lower end of the tube is reached, and here the cleavage continues for about 2 days before the multicellular cluster is expelled into the uterus. The full reason for this delay is not clear, but it serves to retain the cleaving blastomeres until the uterine lining is suitably prepared to receive its prospective guest, if fertilization is successful, of course. Since the human egg contains little inert yolk material and since this is distributed rather evenly throughout the cytoplasm, the daughter cells of each mitosis are practically equal in size and composition. This type of cleavage is known as total equal cleavage. The sticky blastomeres adhere, so you can see there, and the cluster is still retained for a time within mangyapon sang gelatinous capsule sang zona pellucida that had enclosed the growing and ovulated oocyte. There is no growth in the rapidly dividing blastomeres. Naga-divide lang gid sila, wala sila nagadako. So, the total mass of living substance does not increase during the cleavage period. By the fourth day after fertilization, day 4, a cluster of about 12 blastomeres passes from the uterine tube into the uterus. No? As you can see there, letter D. And at this stage, the cluster is called morula na ang tawag. By the time some 30 blastomeres have been produced, pools of clear fluid accumulate between some of the internal cells, and these spaces soon coalesce into the common subcentral cavity. The resulting hollow cellular ball is what we call the blastula of a type or the particular type that occurs in mammals and is called a blastocyst. Ang cavity, it is called the blastocell. Let's go to the implantation and placentation. 6 to 10 days after fertilization, the naked sticky blastocyst comes into contact with the uterine lining and nagatapik siya dito. The site of attachment is variable and not predetermined. The uterine lining has already been preparing under the influence of ovarian hormones para ma-receive niya ang blastocyst. Among these preparations has been the elaboration and expulsion by the uterine glands of a secretion that serves as nourishment for the blastocyst, both when it is free and during its implantation. Directly after blastocyst attachment come an establishment within the thickened uterine lining and the participation of its ang ginatawag nga trophoblastic capsule in the differentiation of a placenta, a structure that enables the developing embryo to enter into a direct psychological dependence on the mother. Dito na siya mapasang nutrients. In implantation, the trophoblast of the blastocyst exerts an enzymic destructive influence on the swollen uterine lining, leading to erosion of both the superficial epithelium sang uterine lining and also ang deeper connective tissue. This early stage of invasion ends in a few days. The blastocyst is then completely buried within a more superficial and compact layer of the total uterine lining. And what happens is while the blastocyst is completing this phase of implantation, its original shell of cellular trophoblasts steadily proliferates a multitude of cells that lose their outermost membranes and they merge. The result is a thick peripheral layer consisting of a common mass of cytoplasm in which, as you can see there, many nuclei are embedded. This external investment is called the syncytial thry- trypoblast. The syncytial trypoblast. Ang implanted nga blastocyst They then proceed to establish itself as dependent upon the uterus. The syncytial trophoblast becomes a spongy shell na containing irregular cavities. This expanding mass destroys connective tissue and glands encountered in its path, both the cellular and derivative syncytial trophoblast have ang capacity to destroy such tissue. And the erosive process also taps ang uterine capillaries connected to spiral arteries. Blood liberated from the capillaries is taken up into the trophoblastic lacunae. The spiral arteries are then invaded by the trophoblast and increase in diameter nagadako. They are known as uteroplacental arteries na ang tawag sa ila and are no longer under maternal or maternal vasomotor control. This conversion process ensures that may adequate volume of blood nga labot sa gin-implant nga embryo. So, ang erosive activities decline in intensity by the end of the third week na sa development, and at this time, ang sac is completing its first phase sang specialization. Occasionally, ang fertilized egg pwede nga mag-fail to reach the uterus. Ang implanting and beginning to develop, naga-implant sila elsewhere. And this outcome, it's called the ectopic pregnancy. You may have heard of the word ectopic pregnancy, or it's also called the extrauterine pregnancy because wala siya kalabot sa uterus. The most common ectopic site is the uterine tube, ang fallopian tube. This type of pregnancy, if not treated, it can be fatal for the mother, but the peritoneum lining, the abdominal cavity, and even the interior of the ovary are also involved, though rarely. The unsuitability of all these sites for continued development usually leads to early death and resorption of the embryo. So in placentation, the irregular strands of invasive syncytial trophoblast constitute a first stage in the formation of true villi, which form part of the placenta and are briefly described as ang primitive connective tissue nagaline the interior sang blastocyst wall, and ang complex nga trophoblast kag connective tissue is they are now called the chorion. As you can see there sa day 23, connective tissue promptly grows into the trophoblastic strands and blood vessels develop in the tissue. The result is the production of many chorionic villi, each resembling, as you can see there, daw naga-branching siya. So, tiny branching bushes. In the fourth week of development, the essential arrangement have been established that make possible those physiological exchanges between mother and fetus that characterize the remainder of the pregnancy. The deepest embedded portion of the chorionic wall becomes the so-called chorionic plate na. And from the plate extend the main stems of the chorionic villi, which give off progressively subdividing branches. In general, the side branches are free, whereas apical ones tend to attach to the maternal tissue and serve as anchors para hindi makakas. The villus trees occupy a labyrinth space between the villi that was created by erosion of the uterine lining. Trophoblast not only covers the chorionic plate and its villi but also spreads like a carpet over the eroded surface of the maternal tissue. Top uterine arteries open into the trophoblast-lined intervillous space, and ang blood bathing the branches and twigs of the villainous trees. This blood nagadrain from the intervillous space through the similarly tapped veins, arterial blood of the embryo, and later fetus passes through vessels of the umbilical cord to the chorionic plate. Hence, it is distributed to the villus stems, and then it branches and twigs through vessels in their connective tissue course. Return of this blood to the fetus is by a reverse route lang. The circulation of maternal blood through the intervillous space is wholly separate from fetal blood coursing through the chorion and its villi. Communication between the two is solely by diffusive interchange. The barrier between the two circulations consists of the trophoblastic covering of villi, the connective tissue of the villus course, and the thin lining of the capillaries that are contained in the villus course. The placenta serves, nagaserve siya sang fetus or it helps the fetus in several ways, most of which involve interchanges ng materials nga carried from the bloodstream sang mother to the fetus or vice versa. And these functions are of the following kinds. These five: nutrition, respiration, excretion, barrier action, synthesis of hormones, and enzyme. For the barrier action, examples are prevention of intrusive bacteria. The way in which the encapsulating membrane of the blastocyst becomes the chorion, and the most deeply embedded part of it becomes the fetal placenta. It has already been uh, considered as extra embryonic membranes. There are still other important membranes that develop from these portions of the inner cell mass of the blastocyst that are not directly involved in becoming the embryo. So they are called extra embryonic membranes. For the yolk sac, the cells split off from the inner cell mass of the blastocyst and fashion themselves into a primitive yolk sac. The roof of the sac then folds into a tubular gut, whereas the remainder becomes a vascularized bag that attains the size of a small pea. In other vertebrates, such as, for example, amphibians, birds, the yolk sac is large and it contains a store of nutritive yolk. But in humans and other mammals, there is practically wala. No, there are none. A slender neck, the yolk stalk, ang tawag, soon connects the rapidly elongating gut with the fast-growing yolk sac proper. The stalk detaches from the embryo intestine early in the second month of pregnancy, but the shrunken sac commonly persists and can be found and expelled after birth. Nagaupod siya. Let's go to the amnion. As you can see there, still at day 23, a cleft separates the outermost cells of the inner cell mass of the blastocyst from the remainder, which then becomes the embryonic disc. The split off, thin upper layer is the amnion.
which remains attached to the periphery of the embryonic disc. As a disc folds into a cylindrical embryo, the amniotic margin follows the underfolding, and its line of union becomes limited to the ventral body wall, where the umbilical cord attaches. The amnion becomes a tough, transparent, non-vascular membrane that gradually fills the chorionic sac and then fuses with it. At the end of the third month of pregnancy, the non-placental extent of this nearly exposed double membrane comes into contact with the lining of the uterus elsewhere, and fusion then obliterates the uterine cavity, which has been undergoing progressive reduction in size. For the remainder of the pregnancy, the only cavity within the uterus is that of ang ginatawag nga fluid-filled amniotic sac. Clear, watery fluid fills the amniotic sac, and the embryo is suspended in this fluid and thus can maintain its shape and mold its body form without hindrance. Throughout pregnancy, the amniotic sac serves as a water cushion, absorbing mga jolts, equalizing pressure, and permitting the fetus to change position or to change posture. At childbirth, it acts as a fluid wedge that helps dilate the neck of the uterus, and when the sac ruptures, kung mabuka, about a quart of fluid escapes as the waters. Aram lang maghambal nga na nagputok na ang panubigan. So if the sac does not rupture or if it covers the head at birth, it is known as a caul. Mera man nga people nga for example cesarean section, pwede na nila ipagwa ang bata within nga ara pa sa sulod sang amniotic sac. Let's go to allion aliontois. The aliontois is a tube of endoderm that grows out of the early yolk sac in the region that soon becomes the hindgut. The tube extends into a bridge of mesoderm that connects embryo with the chorion and will become incorporated into the umbilical cord. The human aliontoic tube is tiny and never becomes a large sac with important functions as it does in many other mammals and in reptiles and birds. Sa humans ya wala. In the second month, it ceases to grow and it soon is obliterated. Blood vessels, however, develop nearly sa mesodermal sheath, and these spread into the chorion and nagavascularize. Throughout pregnancy, they will keep the embryo and in close relationship with the mother's uterine circulation. Let's go to the umbilical cord. As the ventral body wall closes in, the yolk stalk and allantois are brought together along with their mesodermal sheaths and blood vessels, enclosing everything as a wrapping of amnion. In this manner, a cylindrical structure, the umbilical cord comes to connect the embryo with the placenta. It will serve the embryo and fetus as a physiological lifeline, literal, throughout pregnancy. The mature cord is about 1.3 centimeter or zero point 0.5 inch in diameter, and it attains an average length of 50 centimeter or 1.6 feet. Let's go to the formation of the three
Primary germ layers. The inner cell mass attached to the deep pole of the implanted blastocyst is sometimes called the embryoblast, since it contains the cells that will form an embryo. So the cellular mass enters into the process of ginatawag nga gastrulation, through which the three primary germ layers segregate. The gastrula stage, it is the next advanced after the blastula. It begins to take form. So first, the cells facing the cavity of the blastocyst arrange into a layer known as the hypoblast. The thick residual layer, temporarily designated as epiblast, is the source of a definitive uppermost sheet, ang ginatawag nga ectoderm. And next is ang intermediate layer that is called the mesoderm. Kaysa to nga. In this second phase of gastrulation, some cells of the epiblast migrate to the midline position, then turn downward and emerge beneath the mesoderm, or beneath as mesoderm. Such cells continue to spread laterally, left and right and left, between the endoderm and the residue of epiblast, which is now uh, definitive ectoderm. Ang primitive streak is the site where migratory mesodermal cells leave the epiblast. It is elongated and crowded seam. Similar migrating cells produce a thick knob at the end of the primitive streak, and their continued forward movement from this so-called primitive knot produces a dense band that becomes a rod-like notochord. Here are the germ layers. Uh, they are not segregated sheets whose cells have predetermined limited capacities and inflexibly fixed fates in carrying out organ building activities. Rather, the layers represent advantageously located assembly grounds out of which the component parts of the embryo emerge normally, according to a master constructional plan that assigns different parts to definite spatial positions and local sites. Thus, although the germ layers have developmental potencies in excess of their normal developmental fates, their ordinary participation in organ forming does not deviate from a definite standard program. Only the principal functional tissue is designated in the name of each primary germ layer, and in a few instances, such as the suprarenal glands and the teeth, um, a compound organ has important parts of different origin. Let's go to the growth and differentiation. Growth is an increase in size or bulk. Cell multiplication is fundamental to an increase in bulk, but does not by itself result in growth. It merely produces more units to participate in subsequent growing. Growth is accomplished in several ways. Most important is synthesis, by which new living matter, cytoplasm, is created from available foodstuffs. Another method utilizes water uptake. A human embryo of the early weeks is nearly 98% water, while an adult is 70% fluid. A third method of growth is by intercellular deposition, in which cells manufacture and extrude non-living substances, such as, for example, jelly, fibers, and the ground substance of cartilage and bone. Because of these activities, a newborn baby is several thousand million times heavier than the zygote.
from which it developed. Uniform growth throughout the substance of a developing organism would merely produce a steadily enlarging spherical cellular mass. Gapabilog lang. Local diversities in forms and proportions result in differential rates of growth that operate in different regions at different times as well. The particular program of starting times and growth rates, both externally and internally in the human embryo, constitutes its characteristic growth pattern. Abnormal growth occurs occasionally, and growth may be excessive or deficient, sobra or kulang. Also, such departures may be general or local, symmetrical or asymmetrical. Um, Examples: general gigantism usually starts before birth, and the oversized baby continues to grow at an accelerated rate. Dasig. In some instances, the existing hereditary predisposition for gigantism may not manifest until sometime during childhood. So, in a reverse manner, general dwarfism naman may exist before birth, with the individual continuing to grow only at a small amount lang after birth, and with growth then stopping at the usual time. In another departure from the usual growth pattern, the individual may be average in size at birth and grow normally for a while, with growth then coming to a premature arrest. In developing organism, differentiation implies increasing structural and functional complexity. One kind sang differentiation concerns changes sa gross shape and organization. Such activities related to molding the body and its integral parts into form and pattern comprise the processes called morphogenesis. The process of morphogenesis are relatively simple mechanical acts: cell migration, cell aggregation, uh, forming masses, cords, and sheets. Next is localized growth or retardation resulting in enlargement or constriction. Fourth is fusion. Fifth is splitting, including separation of single sheets into separate layers, formation of cell cavities in cell masses, and forking of cords. Sixth, folding, including circumscribed folds that produce in-pocketings and out-pocketings. Seventh, bending, which, like folding, results from unequal growth. A second kind of differentiation refers to progressive changes occurring in the substance and structure of cells, whereby different kinds of tissues are created. These changes and the synthetic processes underlying them constitute ang ginatawag nga histogenesis. Ang zygote, that contains all the essential factors for development, um, they exist solely as encoded set of instructions localized in the genes of chromosomes, and wala sila may ginabear nga physical relationship to future characteristics of a developing embryo. During histogenesis, these instructional mga blueprints nga ginatawag are decoded and transformed through cytoplasmic synthesis into several types and subtypes of tissues that are structural and functional units sang that will gradually become ang ginatawag nga organs, no? And at first, the cells of its germ layer lack an identifiable shape and are similar in biochemical composition. But selective gene expression processes soon enter. Pagkatapos ng elaboration of mga specific enzymes or mga enzyme patterns and mga synthesis, ang certain groups of cells, they progressively assume mga distinctive characteristics that permit kung magiging ano sila to be recognized, such as ang mga early stages, indefinite lines of differentiation of cells, they're often designated by the suffix blast, no? Whatever blast they are, no? As in, for example, mga myoblast, mga neuroblast, no? Mga different, ano na sila, different types of cells. Uh, the emerging cell, they are discrete entities without intermediates. For example, mga transitional form between muscle cell and nerve cell, they are never seen. Neither can different local parts of a cell carry out def- uh, different types of tissue specialization, such as nerve cell at one end, muscle end at another end. Nor can a cell once fully committed to a particular type, kung naging particular type na siya of specialization, uh, they can't abandon it and adopt a new course. Under certain conditions, though, may mga differentiated cells na pwede mag-return sa simpler state. Thus, under a changed environment, ang cartilage may lose its matrix and its cells may come to resemble the more primitive tissue from which it arose, nagabalik siya, or pwede siya magbalik. Nevertheless, despite such rehearsal and mga apparent simplification or mga ginatawag tanga de-differentiation, these cells retain their former histological specificity. Under suitable environment conditions, they can differentiate again but can only regain their previous definitive characteristics as cartilage cells. So here, the final results kung sa histogenesis is ang production of group of cells similar in structure and function. So it includes nervous, muscular, connective tissue, cartilage, bone, and also the two further specialized type nga cartilage and bone. In human embryonic disc, at 18 days, this is what it looks like. Embryonic acquisition of external form, development between the second and fourth weeks. At the end of the second week, the embryonic region is a nearly circular plate within its well-embedded, differentiating chorionic sac. This embryonic disc consists of two layers, ang epiblast and hypoblast. A hollow dome-shaped amnion sac attaches to the margin of the upper layer of the disc, and a hollow yolk sac is similarly continuous with the lower layer. A broad cellular bridge attaches to the complex of the chorion, and the most important event during the third week is the gastrulation process, which we have already mentioned. Early in the third week, the embryonic disc has enlarged and become pear-shaped in outline, and a well-formed primitive streak occupies the midline of the caudal half, which is narrower. Cells from the epiblast are passing through the streak and spreading laterally in both directions beneath the uppermost layer, and is now called the ectoderm. In this way, the embryonic disc acquires three distinctive layers. Ang gastrula stage of development comes to an end. At the middle of the week, a thickening known as the head process It is extending forward from a knob-like primitive knot located at the head end of the primitive streak, and these linear thickenings define the median plane of the future embryo and thus divide the embryonic disc into precise right and left halves. In the fourth week, the embryo goes beyond the external characteristics of vertebrates and becomes recognizable na as a mammal. The week is marked by profound changes during which the embryo acquires its general body plan, and there is an increase in total length from about 2 to 5 millimeters, about mga 0.2 inch, but size is quite variable. Hindi man siya fixed among smaller specimens. Better correlated with the degree of development is the number ng mesodermal somites, which attain their full number of mga around 42 during the fourth week. Some of the head of the early embryo arises from the embryonic disc in primitive knot, but sa primitive streak, naga-shorten siya and its caudal retreat continues. Nagalaba. Such structure as the neural tube and notochord are added, and progressively sa pag retreat and ang additional somite pairs, they appear in steady succession. Naga-form na siya as though um, nakita mo ng form sang mammal. Ang most important maneuver in the establishment ng general body form is ang transformation sang flat embryonic disc into a roughly nagahimo sa cylinder, no, ang early embryo, which is attached to the yolk sac by a slender yolk stalk nga ginatawag ginatawag sa illustration. Three factors cooperate in producing the change. So as you can see there, these are the three, and which is may more rapid expansion sang embryonic area, may overgrowth, whereas nagakatabo ang unfolding, underfolding as well, and a certain amount of true constriction through growth gathers all the parts sa future nga umbicu, uh, umbilicus. Kaya manog manog form na ang umbilical cord. So throughout the entire period, when the body and its parts are being laid down, developmental advances tend to appear. Sa first is the head end and the progress tailward. For this reason, many structures that extend along the body for a distance show ang gradual lang nga pagdevelop. The size advantage gained initially by the head end of the embryo is relinquished very slowly. Even in an infant, the relatively large head and long arms are striking, right? So a further tendency toward progressively graded development occurs from the mid-dorsal line in a lateral and the ventral direction. All such relations are the visible expressions of stages in growth and differentiation. And sa early week 4, ang cylindrical shape ng embryo is plain even though the folding off process is far from complete. The neural tube is still open near both ends, and the head end of the broader neural folds indicate nga may future brain na, and even ang three primary divisions. A pronounced bulge sa dalum sang brain region, wala pa sang brain, pero ang brain region, it denotes nga kung diin ma-form ang heart, and also prompt circulation through placenta. During the middle and late days sang week 4, there are marked advances na makita mas may damo man nga makita nga changes, ang mga accelerated growth along the dorsal region that bends the total body length, nag-assume na sang C shape, and the tips of the head and the tail are not far apart, and easily recognizable na ang mga more parts, no? Forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain, they can be identifiable na, so may brain part na somehow, largely because of a sharp bend sa midbrain. And local outgrowth from each side of the forebrain produces ang eye cups. Kag ang pairs ang in-pocketing sa ectoderm alongside sa likod sang brain part naga-sync. And then, mayara naman sang doga form nga inner ear, no? And bulges indicative of the heart and liver, kitaon naman. And ang formation nga ginatawag nga bronchial arches sa lungs. Kitaon naman. And also, may ara na nga ginatawag nga pair swellings or ang buds sang trunk sang gina or ang ginatawag nga paired swellings wherein dara na ma-appear ang mga limbs, no? Ang duwa ka arms, duwa ka leg. So, developmental changes naman sa week 5 and up to week 8. A 5-week embryo is about 8 millimeter long, whereas at 6 weeks, the length is about 13 millimeter. New external features are mga olfactory pits, sa ilong bala, at the tip of the bent head. Then, may umbilical cord naman, and its proximal end sa umbilical cord occupying a low position on the abdominal wall, and the sharply bent head joins the rest of the body at an acute angle. The first pair sang bronchial arches branch naga Y, nagapa-Y ang iyang position, and the external ears are forming around the pair grooves located between each half sang mandible and each second bronchial arc. Ang heart, which was previously chief ventral prominence siya, subong nag-share na sa distinction sang liver. Nag-grow naman ang liver. So, mga limb buds, they have elongated markedly and become flattened, and may ara sang constriction sa mga ear, sa mga bud niyan eh. Ito bilang mga limbs, no? They separate as a paddle-like hand na, mamiga eminent, and meron man foot plate, no, from a cylindrical segment. And predictably, ang upper limbs, they are somewhat further advanced than the lower pair. Mas una ang upper limbs nag-develop. In the latter weeks of the second month, developmental changes advance from those distinguished primates to a state that is mas ma-distinguish mo na as human being at the end of the second month, when it is about 30 millimeter, the embryo stage ends na, no? Hindi na siya embryo. So, ang term na nga ginagamit is fetus. The term fetus is used to describe the developing conceptus until birth. Let's go to fetal development. Fetal development in the seventh week up to week 8, na the head becomes more erect and the previously curved trunk becomes more straight na. The heart, also the liver, they are earlier dominated. The shapes ang they dominated ang full shapes ng lawas. Subong they yield to a more evenly rounded na chest, abdomen region na lang sila. Ah, kay nagadako na ang body sang fetus. So the tail, which at an earlier time was 1/5 siya sang embryo's length, now it becomes inconspicuous both through actual and regression and through concealment by the growing buttocks. So wala na sang ang tail, though kumaga na-outgrow na siya sang lawas and may naga-form na nga buttocks area. The face rapidly acquires a fairly human appearance na because the eyes, the ears, the jaws, they are more prominent, mas makita na. The eyes, previously located on the sides of the head, kagina, subong, at week 7 to 8, they are more forward. No? And the nose, it still lacks a bridge and though ano siya, though pug-like nga pagka-nose, but it's there. You can see it. And they are directed forward instead of downward, just like a pug. So, ang mandibular branch of each, 'di ba, Y-shaped branchial area, they combine to form the lower jaw. So, diri na sa may jaw part up to the ang respiratory system. It is gradually forming. And the maxillary branch on each side joins the elevation of the medial side of the corresponding nostril to produce more complicated upper jaw. So, yeah. Also the limbs, ang mga kamot, mga legs, they become jointed. And sa earlier, ang hand plates and foot plates, nag-differentiate na sila sa terminal digits or fingers. And primitive external genitalia appear, but it is not yet clear kung male or female. So for this, ano pa siya? Sexless condition pa siya. So most of all the internal organs were laid down at the end of the 8 weeks when the embryo is little more than 25 millimeter and the characteristic external features are established and subsequent growth merely modifies existing proportions without adding new structure. Similarly, the chief extends or changes ang mga change nag-undergone sa internal organs and parts ng growth of the tissue specialization. Sa 8 weeks, the neuromuscular mechanism attains a degree of perfection that permits some response to delicate stimulation. During sang third month, the young fetus clearly resembles a human being, although the head is disproportionately large, gidya. And the previous protrusion of much more of the intestines into the umbilical cord, they are reduced through the return of its loops into the abdomen. Also, the ears, as you can see here, they rise to eye level. And the eyelids fuse shut. La pa, syempre. Sarado pa. And the nails, they already are forming. No? May ossification naman or naga-form naman na matamatang bones. And sex of external genitalia, medyo naga-form na. No? So, yaman na siya. At 4 months, ang individual differences between phases ng fetus, they become more distinguishable. The face is broad, but ang eyes, subong, they are widely separated na. And the umbilical cord, they attach to the abdominal wall much higher. So this location is above an expanding region between the cord and the pubis. So nagasaka na ang ang navel. So yeah, muna. And sa 5 months, may ginatawag na nga downy hairs or lanugo. They cover the body, and some heads may nagatubo nga na nga hair. So the skin is transparent still, and fetal movements are felt by the mother. At 6 months, nag-form na ang eyebrows, eyelashes, na, and then the body is lean but it has proportions. Na, nag-improve na ang proportions, ang ratio. The skin is wrinkled, reddish, no? And pa-smear siya sang, or it is smeared with a greasy substance, which is called the vernix caseosa. The eyelids reopen, and at 8 months, fat is depositing beneath the skin. The testes begin to invade the scrotum sa male fetus. And at 9 months, the dull redness of the skin fades and wrinkles smooth out. The body and limbs become better rounded. Mas mayo na ang proportion. At full term, 38 weeks, the body is plump and proportions are improved, although the head is very large man gyapon, and the lower limbs are still slightly shorter than the upper limbs. The skin has lost its coat of lanugo hair, nadula na, but it's still smeared with vernix caseosa. So, ang nails, kitaon na, sa mga end bala sang sang fingers and sang toes. And then, ang umbilical cord, it now attaches to the center na sang abdomen. And the testes of males are usually ara na sa scrotum, the greater lips of the female external genitalia. Sa una, wala pa na. But now, it is in contact. Ang skull or the cranial bones, they meet except some mga angular junctions or ang ginatawag nga diri ba ang soft spot. So wala pa siya nag-form. So the average time of delivery is 280 days from the beginning of the last menstrual period, whereas the duration of pregnancy or the age of the baby is about 266 days in 38 weeks. So, ang pregnancy may extend up to 300 days or more, in which case the baby tends to be heavier, mas bugat na siya. And some naman niya 27 weeks lang, which is ang baby is premature. And in this case, it is less likely to survive, no? So, those naman niya nga more than 30 weeks old, okay lang. They still usually do survive. No? So, it is important to have ano gid, uh, neonatal care and prenatal care and neonatal care. So, we'll continue this in a next video. to avoid information overload.